The first one climbed the support beam on a Wednesday. And I know it was a Wednesday because I'd been carving the days into the railing of platform 6 with a chisel, and the mark I'd made that morning was the 43rd since I'd stopped counting anything else. My name is Porter Ellison. Before the outbreak, I was a Finnish carpenter. The kind of tradesman people hired when they wanted joints that disappeared and surfaces that felt like they'd grown rather than been built. I worked high-end residential in Ashland, Oregon, building custom cabinetry for people who could afford to care about the difference between quarter-sawn and flat-sawn white oak. I understood wood the way some people understand language. Its grain, its tension, its memory. Wood remembers every stress it has ever absorbed, and if you know how to read the annual rings, you can tell whether a tree grew in drought or abundance, in shelter or in wind. The Rogue River lumber mill sat 14 miles northeast of Ashland in a valley bracketed by the Siskiyou foothills. It had ceased commercial operation in 2019, another casualty of shifting economics and the slow death of Oregon's timber industry. The mill's owners had stripped the valuable equipment and left the rest. A 3-story main processing building with steel-reinforced timber framing, a log yard covering 2 acres of compacted gravel, a kiln shed, a maintenance shop, and a network of conveyor gantries that extended from the yard into the upper floors of the mill like the skeletal arms of something reaching. I came to the mill on day 1 because I understood its bones. The main building's timber frame was Douglas fir. Old growth, dense, with the structural integrity that modern lumber can't replicate. The floor beams were 16 by 16, capable of bearing loads that would buckle engineered wood. The gantry system, originally designed to carry 1,000-pound logs from yard to saw, provided an elevated network of platforms and walkways that connected the mill's upper reaches in a web of steel and timber 30 feet above the ground. 30 feet. That number mattered because on day 1, when I drove my truck through the mill's chain-link gate with everything I owned in the bed and the sound of Ashland dying in my rearview mirror, I didn't know yet that they could climb. Nobody knew. The early reports said they couldn't. The early reports said the motor degradation that accompanied infection made coordinated vertical movement impossible. The early reports were written by people who had observed the infected for hours, not weeks. I wasn't alone when I arrived. Ruth Okada was already there. A 68-year-old retired millwright who had worked at Rogue River for 31 years before its closure, and who had returned, she told me, because it was the only structure within 50 miles whose mechanical systems she understood completely. Ruth was sitting on an overturned bucket in the maintenance shop, eating canned pears with a socket wrench on her knee when I pulled through the gate. "Carpenter," she said, looking at my truck bed. The hand tools, the lumber rack, the organized bins of fasteners that I'd loaded before loading food because my priorities, in those first hours, were still calibrated to a world that valued joinery. "Finish, carpenter," I said. "Close enough. Can you frame?" "I can frame." "Good. Because I can keep every machine in this building running, but I can't build a wall that holds." That was Ruth. No introduction, no pleasantries, no negotiation of trust. She identified a deficit, confirmed the supply, and proceeded to the next task. She'd been at the mill for 6 hours before I arrived. In that time, she'd restored power to the maintenance shop using the mill's backup diesel generator, surveyed the gantry system for structural integrity, and inventoried every tool in the building. She'd also welded the front gate shut. "Welded it," I said. "With the shop's MIG unit. Nothing's coming through that gate without a cutting torch." "What about the fencing?" "Chain link, 8 feet, barb top. Adequate for now, not adequate for later." "What does later look like?" She finished the pears, set the can on the workbench, and looked at me with eyes that had spent 3 decades reading the tolerances of industrial machinery and understood, intrinsically, what happens when systems exceed their design limits. "Later looks like more of them and fewer of us," she said. "So we build up." Ruth's plan was vertical. She articulated it that first evening over a dinner of canned soup heated on a camp stove in the maintenance shop while the generator hummed and the valley darkened around us. "The gantry system connects the upper floors," she said, spreading a hand-drawn diagram of the mill across the workbench. "Platforms at 30, 35, and 40 feet. The original conveyors are gone, but the structural steel is sound. I checked every weld this afternoon. The floor of the main building is ground level, indefensible. The upper floors are accessible only by internal stairs and the gantry walkways from the log yard. So we live upstairs and remove the stairs. We live on the gantry and remove everything below it. The internal stairs get demolished. The gantry walkways get modified with removable sections, bridges we can pull up behind us. The ground becomes theirs. The air becomes ours. It was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its implications. We would build a village in the sky. Platforms, shelters, walkways, storage, all suspended on the mill's existing structural framework, all accessible only by routes we could sever in seconds. An arboreal settlement made of milled lumber, held aloft by the bones of the industry that had produced it. I started building the next morning, the mill's lumber storage. A warehouse adjacent to the main building still held thousands of board feet of dimensional stock, 2x6s, 2x8s, 4x4 posts, sheets of plywood, material that had been too low grade to sell before the closure, material that was now the most valuable substance in the Rogue Valley. Platform 1 went up on the main gantry in 2 days. 12 by 16 feet, framed with doubled 2x8s on 16-inch centers, decked with 3/4-inch plywood, secured to the gantry's steel I-beams with through bolts that I torqued to specification, because structural failure at 30 feet is not a mistake you learn from. Ruth supervised the connection points, checking each bolt against the gantry's load ratings, which she knew from memory the way I knew the moisture content specifications for cabinet-grade hardwood. This beam was rated for a continuous load of 12,000 pounds, she said, tapping a flange with her wrench. Your platform and 2 people won't exceed 800. We have margin. Margin. The word became our currency. Every decision was measured in margin. Structural margin, caloric margin, temporal margin. How much weight could we add before the steel complained? How many days of food remained before we needed to forage? How much time did we have before the valley's infected population reached a density that made ground-level movement impossible? On day 4, we got our answer to the last question. I was on the gantry framing platform 2 when Ruth called from her position at the maintenance shop's upper window. She had binoculars trained on the access road below. "Porter, come see this." I crossed the walkway and looked. The road that connected the mill to the county highway ran straight for a 1/4 mile before curving into the foothills. On that 1/4 mile of straight road, I counted 14 figures. They moved with the gait I'd seen in the early broadcasts. Stiff, arrhythmic, as though the signal between brain and legs was being routed through damaged circuitry. They were heading generally north, following the road, but their trajectory wobbled. 3 of them drifted toward the mill's fence line. One reached the chain link and stood there, hands at its sides, head moving in slow oscillation. "The weld on the gate will hold," Ruth said. "The fence won't, not if enough of them press against it simultaneously." "How many is enough?" Chain link is rated for lateral force, not sustained distributed pressure. 15 bodies leaning against a single section would deform it, 20 would breach it. 14 on the road, 3 at the fence, day 4. "We need to accelerate the build," I said. "We need more people," Ruth said. "More hands, more skills." More people means more weight on the gantry, more food consumption, more noise. She lowered the binoculars and looked at me. "More people also means someone to stand watch while we sleep, someone to forage while we build, someone to fix what breaks while we build what's next. You're a carpenter, Porter. You know that a structure with only 2 load-bearing points is the first thing that falls." I looked at the 14 figures on the road and the 3 at the fence and the platforms above us. 2 built, 4 planned, a village in the air that existed mostly in my head. And I conceded the point. Not because Ruth was wrong about the math, but because she was right about the architecture. 2 people is a camp. A village requires a village. That evening, Ruth powered up the mill's PA system. A horn and speaker array originally used to signal shift changes, still wired to the maintenance shop's electrical panel. She broadcast a message on a loop aimed at the surrounding valley. "Rogue River Lumber Mill, survivors welcome. Bring tools if you have them." The horn carried 2 miles. So did everything it attracted. They came in pairs and singles over the next 6 days. Marcus Webb arrived on day 5, a 26-year-old arborist from Talent who had spent the outbreak's first week in a white oak 60 feet above his employer's yard, watching the town below disintegrate from a vantage point he'd climbed to professionally and refused to leave personally. Marcus understood trees the way I understood milled lumber, as living systems with structural logic. He also understood climbing in a way that no one else in the group would match. Harness work, rope systems, ascent and descent under load. When he walked through the mill gate, we'd unwelded a section and rigged a quick-release barrier. He looked up at the gantry and the platforms, and his face did something I recognized. A climber seeing a canopy. "I can rig vertical access routes," he said. "Rope systems with quick-release anchors, faster than ladders, retractable, impossible to ascend without hands that work properly." "Their hands work," I said. "Their coordination doesn't. A dynamic rope under tension requires grip strength and contralateral limb sequencing. From what I've seen, they can grab, but they can't hold and pull simultaneously." He'd observed them from his oak tree for 7 days. His data was anecdotal, but granular. He'd watched them attempt to climb his tree 11 times. Each attempt followed the same pattern. Initial grip on the trunk, 1 or 2 upward movements, then a failure of coordination between arms and legs that resulted in a fall. The bark of his oak had been scarred by fingernails at a height of approximately 8 feet. None had reached higher. 8 feet. The gantry platform started at 30. 22 feet of margin. Marcus began rigging the next morning. He established rope access points at 3 locations on the gantry, each consisting of a static line with a friction device that required a specific hand-over-hand technique to ascend. A technique that depended on the motor planning his observations suggested the infected lacked. At each access point, the rope could be detached from the lower anchor and hauled up, leaving nothing for anything below to grip. On day 7, Nora Castellan and her brother Felix arrived. Nora was 32, a large animal veterinarian who had been making a farm call outside Jacksonville when the outbreak reached the valley. Felix was 28, an electrician who had been wiring a new barn on the same farm. They'd survived the first week in the farm's hayloft and had heard Ruth's broadcast on the second night it ran. Nora brought medical knowledge and a surgical kit she'd assembled from her veterinary supplies. Felix brought wire, conduit, and the ability to extend the mill's electrical system from the generator to every platform on the gantry. Within 2 days of their arrival, Platform 3 had lighting. LED strips powered by a circuit Felix ran through rigid conduit along the gantry's steel framework, giving the upper reaches of the mill a warm glow visible from the valley floor after dark. "Turn those off," I said on the first night. "Why?" Felix asked. "Because everything in the valley can see them. Everything in the valley already knows we're here." Ruth broadcast for 6 days on a PA system. "The lights aren't giving away a secret. They're declaring a position." He was right, and the distinction mattered. The mill was not a hidden bunker. It was not a concealed shelter designed for invisibility. It was a visible, audible, illuminated settlement that declared its existence to the valley and dared the valley to respond. This was Ruth's philosophy, and it was the opposite of everything my instincts preferred. I wanted to hide. Ruth wanted to stand. "A structure people can see is a structure people can find," she said, "and the people who find it are the people who build it next." By day 12, we were 7. The last arrival was Deacon Pryor, a 53-year-old sawyer who had operated the Rogue River Mill's primary breakdown saw for 19 years before the closure. Deacon knew the mill's main building the way Ruth knew its mechanical systems. Intimately, structurally, with the physical memory of a body that had moved through its spaces 10 hours a day for 2 decades. He walked onto the gantry for the first time and pointed to a junction I'd been reinforcing. "That beam has a split," he said. "Happened in 16 when a log jammed on the carriage and the shock load transferred through the frame. I was standing right there when it cracked. The repair was cosmetic, not structural." I checked. He was right. A hairline fracture concealed beneath a surface plate, invisible to inspection, obvious to a man who had heard it happen. I re-engineered the junction that afternoon, sistering a new beam alongside the damaged one and transferring the load path. The repair took 4 hours and possibly prevented a collapse that would have come weeks later under the accumulated weight of everything we were building. "That's why you need a sawyer," Deacon said, watching me work. "I thought I needed a sawyer for cutting lumber." "You need a sawyer because a sawyer knows where the wood is hurt." By day 20, the village had 6 platforms, and I had started thinking of it as a village because the word camp no longer described what we'd built. Platform 1 was the Commons. The original 12 by 16 deck expanded to 16 by 20, with a roofed shelter framed in 2 by 6 rafters and covered in corrugated metal salvaged from the kiln shed. We ate there, met there, and argued there, which we did with increasing frequency as the population grew and the decisions became more consequential. Platform 2 was storage. Food, water, tools, medical supplies, organized by Nora with a veterinarian's understanding of triage. The things you need fastest go nearest the edge. Platform 3 was Felix and Nora's quarters. An 8 by 10 shelter with the LED lighting that Felix had insisted on, and that I had stopped arguing about because he was right that visibility was a declaration, not an exposure. Platform 4 was Ruth and Deacon's space. They'd gravitated toward each other with the easy compatibility of two people who had shared a workplace for 19 years and who understood, without discussing it, that proximity in a crisis is not intimacy but infrastructure. Platform 5 was Marcus's domain. The rigging station where ropes were stored, inspected, and maintained with the obsessive care of a man whose professional life depended on lines not breaking. He slept beside his gear, which was either dedication or anxiety, and the distinction didn't matter because the result was the same. Every rope in the village was sound. Platform 6 was mine. I'd built it last, at the far end of the gantry, where the framework extended beyond the main building and cantilevered over the log yard. From Platform 6, I could see the entire valley, the access road, the fence line, the surrounding foothills, and increasingly, the figures that populated the ground below. They had accumulated. Ruth's broadcast had drawn survivors, but it had also drawn attention from things that responded to sound with different intent. By day 20, the mill's ground level was no longer empty. A shifting population of infected occupied the log yard. Sometimes a dozen, sometimes 30, drawn by the generator's hum and the sounds of habitation above them. They stood in the gravel and looked up. Not all of them, and not all the time, but enough of them, often enough, that the upward gaze had become a feature of our landscape. We built in the sky, and they watched from below, and the space between us was measured in feet, and in the faith that feet would be enough. Foraging was Marcus's operation. He designed a ground access protocol using a rope descent from the gantry's eastern end, which overhung the lumber warehouse rather than the log yard. The warehouse's upper loading dock. A platform at 12 feet, originally used for stacking outbound shipments, provided a midpoint where a scout could assess ground conditions before descending further. Marcus went down every third day, moving through the mill complex on routes he mapped and revised based on infected position patterns. He brought back water from the creek that ran along the mill's northern boundary, canned goods from a distribution warehouse 2 miles east, and on one occasion, a goat. The goat was a Nubian doe, found wandering the access road on day 16, indifferent to the infected and apparently immune to whatever instinct told other animals to flee. Marcus brought her up the rope system in a sling harness, and she arrived on Platform 2 with the placid dignity of a creature that had survived the end of the world by refusing to acknowledge it. "We're not keeping a goat on a platform 30 feet in the air," I said. "She produces milk," Nora said. "A quart a day, minimum. That's supplemental nutrition for 7 people. She also produces noise and waste, and she weighs 140 pounds on a structure I calculated for human loads." "Your structure has 12,000 pounds of margin," Ruth said. "The goat is within tolerance." The goat stayed. Her name, assigned by unanimous vote over my objection, was Margaret. She occupied a corner of Platform 2 in a pen Marcus built from pallet wood, and she ate scraps and produced milk, and became, against every rational argument I could assemble, the emotional center of the village. People talked to Margaret. Deacon sang to her. Old mill songs from the 1990s that he claimed improved her yield. Nora checked her health daily with more attentiveness than she gave the humans. I stood on Platform 6 on the evening of day 20 and looked down at the log yard where 11 infected figures stood in the last light, their faces angled upward, and I looked across the gantry at 6 people and a goat suspended in a structure I'd built with my hands, and I felt something I hadn't felt since before the outbreak, the specific satisfaction of a craftsman whose work is being inhabited. Day 26 brought the argument that nearly split us apart. Marcus returned from a foraging run with information instead of supplies. 2 miles east, At the distribution warehouse he'd been systematically emptying, he'd found evidence of other survivors. A recently extinguished fire, empty cans still warm, tire tracks in the mud that hadn't been there 3 days earlier. At least 3 people, Marcus said. Maybe more. The fire pit was sized for a group. Did you see them? Ruth asked. No, but I found this. He held up a piece of paper, a hand-drawn map of the valley with the mill marked in red, and the word people written beside it in block letters. Below the map, a message. We see your lights. We have fuel. Can we trade? The note changed the geometry of every calculation I'd been running. Fuel was our critical vulnerability. The diesel generator consumed 8 gallons per day, and our reserve, siphoned from vehicles in the mill's parking area, was down to approximately 90 gallons. 11 days. After that, no power, no lights, no water pump, no charged batteries for the radios Felix had rigged from components found in the maintenance shop. We respond, Ruth said. We meet them. We trade. We don't know who they are, I said. We don't know how many. We don't know their intentions. Their intention is written on the paper. Fuel for. What? What do we trade? Lumber, Deacon said. Everyone looked at him. We're sitting on 100,000 board feet of dimensional stock. Down there in the warehouse. It's worthless to us, beyond what we've already used. But someone trying to build shelter on the ground needs wood. We have wood. They have fuel. That's a trade. The logic was sound. The risk was not. Opening contact with an unknown group meant revealing our population size, our capabilities, our vulnerabilities. It meant showing people where the ropes were, how the access worked, how 7 people lived 30 feet above a world that had ended. We can meet on neutral ground, Marcus said. The warehouse loading dock, public enough to establish trust, elevated enough for me to rig a quick exit. And if they're hostile, I said, then we're 30 feet in the air and they're not. The vote was 6-1. I was the one. Ruth didn't lecture me about it. She simply noted my objection, assigned Marcus to arrange the meeting, and returned to the generator maintenance she'd been performing when the argument started. I found Nora on platform 3 that evening, checking Felix's blood pressure with a veterinary cuff she'd recalibrated for humans. You voted with them, I said. I voted for fuel. Without the generator, I can't maintain cold storage for the medications I've been stockpiling. Some of those medications are the difference between treating an infection and watching someone die from a scratch. There are other ways to get fuel. Name one that doesn't involve Marcus spending 12 hours on the ground in a valley with increasing infected density. I couldn't. Porter, you build beautiful structures. Every joint in this village is precise. Every beam is calculated. But you design for loads. You don't design for people. People are variable. People make choices you can't calculate. And the choice to stay sealed off from every other living human in this valley is a choice that ends with 7 people running out of diesel in 11 days and sitting in the dark. The darkness is survivable. An armed group climbing our ropes is not. Marcus designed the ropes to be unclimbable by infected. A healthy human with hostile intent climbs them in 40 seconds. Our security was never the ropes. It's the height and the visibility. We see everything from up here. That's our advantage, and it works whether we're trading or not. She was right. The village's defensive strength was observation, not isolation. We could see 2 miles in every direction. Any approach was visible for a quarter hour before it reached the fence. The gantry's height gave us the tactical advantage of a castle wall without the castle's obligation to seal its gates. I didn't change my vote, but I stopped arguing against the meeting, which is a carpenter's way of conceding. You stop pushing against the grain and work with it instead. The traders arrived on day 29, 3 of them, as Marcus had estimated, pulling a flatbed trailer loaded with 4 55-gallon drums of diesel behind a pickup truck that had been reinforced with welded steel plate across the windows and grille. They met us at the warehouse loading dock. Marcus and me on the dock at 12 feet, Ruth below, and the 3 newcomers at ground level. The infected population in the log yard had been drawn away by a noise diversion Deacon had set up in the kiln shed. A radio playing static on a loop, enough to pull the dozen bodies that had gathered that morning to the far side of the compound. The traders' leader was a woman named Harlan Slade, late 40s, sunburned, with the lean build and direct speech of someone who had been managing a ranch before the outbreak. and was now managing a survival operation by applying the same principles. She'd brought her son, Kenji, 19, quiet, competent with the truck, and a man named Oren Davalos, a former municipal firefighter from Medford who served as their security. Harlan looked up at the gantry, at the platforms and shelters, and the LED lights that Felix had mounted along the walkways, and she didn't try to hide her assessment. "You built this." "We built this," I said. "How many?" "Enough." "7," Ruth said from below. "7 people, 1 goat, and a carpenter who thinks information is a building material he should hoard." Harlan almost smiled. "We're 12. Ranch property on Bear Creek south of here. We have fuel. The ranch had an agricultural diesel tank, 1,000 gallons. We have livestock. We don't have structures that will hold through winter." "Winter is 5 months away," I said. 5 months is nothing when you're building from scratch on the ground. We need lumber, milled, dimensional, ready to frame. You're sitting on a lumber yard." "What's the exchange rate?" Ruth asked. The negotiation took an hour. Lumber for diesel, a standing arrangement of 500 board feet per 55-gallon drum, delivered monthly. Harlan proposed. Ruth countered with 400 board feet, plus a provision that her group could send a medically trained person to the mill for Nora to assess any health concerns. Harlan accepted. Oren, who hadn't spoken throughout, watched the tree line with the focused vigilance of a man who'd been trained to scan for fire and had transferred the skill to scanning for threats that moved differently than flame but spread with similar indifference. The trade was completed in 2 hours. Kenji drove the truck to the lumber warehouse, where Deacon and I loaded 400 board feet of mixed dimensional stock. 2x6s, 2x8s, 4x4 posts. Onto the flatbed with the efficiency of men performing work their bodies knew. When the last bundle was strapped, Kenji shook my hand with a grip that was firm and brief. "Your platforms," he said. "The joinery is. I've never seen joinery like that on a construction site." "He's a Finnish carpenter," Deacon said. "He builds survival structures with cabinet maker joints. It's like watching a surgeon dig a ditch." "It's structural," I said. "Tight joints transfer load more efficiently." "It's beautiful," Kenji said. "That's what it is." After they left, I stood on the loading dock and watched the truck navigate the access road, weaving around 3 infected that had wandered onto the gravel. The truck passed them without stopping. They turned toward the engine sound and followed for perhaps 50 feet before losing interest. Their attention spans degraded to the point where stimulus required proximity to sustain pursuit. Marcus pulled the ropes back up. The village sealed itself for the night. But the seal had changed. It was no longer absolute. A thread now connected us to 12 people on a ranch 6 miles south. A thread made of lumber and diesel, and a 19-year-old's observation that tight joints were beautiful. The village was no longer an island. It was a node. Ruth found me on platform 6 after dark. "You're not happy," she said. "I'm recalculating." "Recalculating what?" "Load paths, stress distribution. The structural model I built assumed a static population. If we're trading, the population model becomes dynamic. People coming and going, variable loads on the access points. I need to redesign the lower connection framework." She sat on the railing. A railing I'd built with mortise and tenon joints and a 200-pound test load because I couldn't help it, and looked at the valley. "You're redesigning the village to accommodate connection," she said. "I'm redesigning the village to accommodate variable loading." "Same thing, Porter." Day 43. The chisel mark on the railing. The morning everything I'd built was tested against something I hadn't designed for. I was on platform 6 at dawn, performing my daily structural walk. A circuit of every platform, every joint, every connection point. Checking for deflection, checking for fastener fatigue, checking for the small signs of distress that wood displays before it fails. A crack you can hear, a sag you can measure, a joint that has begun to work loose under cyclic loading. The walk took 40 minutes and I performed it every morning because a structure that isn't inspected is a structure that surprises you, and surprises at 30 feet are fatal. I was at the junction between platform 3 and the main walkway when Marcus called from his rigging station on platform 5. His voice was controlled, but carried an undertone I hadn't heard before. The frequency of a man who climbs for a living, encountering something that challenges his understanding of what can climb. "Porter, East Gantry, now." I crossed to his position. He was leaning over the railing, looking down at the eastern access point, the rope system that descended to the lumber warehouse loading dock. The rope was deployed, which meant someone had been down that morning. Felix had volunteered for a dawn water run to the creek. Felix went down at 5:30, Marcus said. He should have been back by 6. It's 6:40. Could be delayed. The creek route takes longer when... Look at the rope. I looked. The static line hung from its upper anchor to the loading dock 12 feet below. At the base of the rope on the dock's edge, something was gripping the line. A hand, discolored, the tendons visible beneath skin that had thinned to a membrane. The hand was pulling downward on the rope, not climbing it. Just pulling, applying force without coordinated intent. Then the second hand appeared, above the first, a grip-release grip pattern that was crude and spastic, but was unmistakably an attempt to ascend. The figure came into view as it hauled itself onto the loading dock railing. Male, wearing the remnants of a maintenance uniform, its movement jerky and discontinuous. It gripped the rope and pulled, its feet scrabbled against the dock's vertical face. It rose 18 inches, fell, gripped again, rose 12 inches, hung for 4 seconds with both hands on the rope and its body swinging, a grotesque pendulum, before falling back to the dock. "They can't climb," I said. "You said they can't climb." I said they couldn't coordinate grip and contralateral movement on a tree trunk. A rope is a different input. The hands can close on a uniform diameter. The feedback is simpler. How much simpler? The figure gripped the rope again. This time it achieved 2 feet of ascent before falling. It didn't land cleanly. It struck the dock railing and tumbled to the gravel below. It lay still for approximately 10 seconds. Then it stood and walked back to the dock and reached for the rope again. "It's learning," Marcus said. "They don't learn." "Then it's iterating. The motor pattern is becoming more efficient with each attempt. The first try was 18 inches. The second was 12. The third was 24. The degradation isn't uniform, Porter. The degradation is selective. Whatever part of the brain handles novel motor acquisition is damaged, but not dead." I watched the figure attempt its fourth ascent. 30 inches. A new record. At this rate of improvement. If rate was even the right concept for a process that might plateau or might not. The figure would reach the gantry's lower framework in a matter of days. "Pull the rope," I said. Marcus detached the lower anchor and hauled the line up. The figure stood on the dock, hands opening and closing on empty air, reaching for a stimulus that was no longer there. It remained on the dock for 11 minutes before wandering to the edge and falling off. It landed in the gravel, stood, and walked toward the log yard where the others milled in their purposeless orbit. "We need to find Felix," I said. "We need to redesign every access point," Marcus said. "Felix first." Felix was fine. He'd taken a longer route to the creek to avoid a cluster of infected near the northern fence and had returned through the maintenance shop's ground floor, where he was currently sitting with a full water container and no knowledge of what had just attempted to follow his rope. When I told him, his face went through a sequence I'd seen in building owners when I explained that a structural member they'd assumed was sound was actually compromised. Denial, calculation, acceptance, and then the question that always followed. What do we do about it? The redesign consumed 5 days and changed the village from a settlement into a fortress. Marcus proposed and I engineered a new access system that addressed the rope vulnerability. The static lines were replaced with a mechanical platform. A cargo elevator, essentially, built from the mill's existing overhead crane components. Ruth and Felix collaborated on the mechanism. A hand-cranked winch mounted on the gantry, connected by cable to a 4-by-6-foot platform that descended to ground level and could be raised to gantry height. The platform had no fixed connection to the ground. When raised, it left nothing below to grip. No rope, no ladder, no surface, just 30 feet of open air between the gantry's underside and the gravel. The elevator worked. It was slow. A full raise took 90 seconds of cranking. And it was loud, the winch mechanism producing a metallic grinding that carried across the log yard. But it was secure. Nothing could ascend without the platform, and the platform couldn't descend without a human operating the winch. But the rope incident had exposed a deeper vulnerability. The gantry's structural framework, the I-beams, the cross-bracing, the support columns, extended from ground level to platform height. The columns were steel, smooth, 12 inches in diameter, not climbable by anything I'd observed. But Marcus's observation haunted me. The degradation is selective. If the infected could iterate on rope climbing, they could potentially iterate on column climbing. The steel was smooth, but the cross-bracing created horizontal footholds at regular intervals. A determined, iterating climber might eventually solve the problem. I proposed wrapping the columns. Deacon cut sheet metal from the kiln shed's exterior cladding, and we fastened it around every support column from ground level to 20 feet. A smooth, featureless sleeve that offered no grip, no foothold, no purchase. The work took 3 days and consumed every rivet in the maintenance shop's inventory. "You're armoring the bones," Deacon said, watching me fasten the last panel. "I'm eliminating the variable. The variable is that they're changing. You can't eliminate that. You can only stay ahead of it." He was right, and the staying ahead became the village's defining rhythm. Each morning, Marcus descended on the elevator platform and performed an observational circuit of the log yard, documenting infected behavior with the methodical focus of his arborist training. Noting grip attempts, vertical reach, any evidence of coordinated movement that exceeded previous observations. He compiled these notes on a board mounted on Platform 5, which became the village's behavioral data center. Day 32. One infected attempted to scale the fence, failed at 6 feet, new maximum. Day 35. 2 infected observed working the same section of fence simultaneously, not coordinated, but convergent. Drawn to the same stimulus, their combined weight deforming the chain link beyond what either could achieve alone. Day 38. 1 infected reached the top of the fence. Barbed wire stopped it. Its hands were damaged, but it had solved the vertical problem of 8-foot chain link. Day 40. 3 infected breached the fence through a section weakened by days of intermittent pressure. They entered the log yard and joined the growing resident population. 47 now occupied the ground below us, a number that had tripled since the PA broadcast began. "We brought them here," I said to Ruth. "We brought everyone here, the living and the dead. That was the choice." "It wasn't my choice." "No, it was mine, and I'd make it again." The alternative was 2 people in the dark, running out of diesel in a building no one would find. I didn't argue. The argument had already been settled by 43 days of construction. 7 people, 1 goat, a trade network, and a population of infected that was growing because we existed and couldn't be culled because we had neither the means nor the will. Nora found me on Platform 6 that night, staring at the ground below. "You're counting them," she said. 47. I counted 49. 2 more came in from the south while you were riveting. 49. The fence is compromised in 2 sections. By next week, the entire perimeter will be meaningless. The perimeter was never the defense. The height is the defense. The height is 30 feet. They gained 2 feet on a rope in 4 attempts. If they iterate on the columns, then Marcus will document it and you'll redesign. That's what you do, Porter. You inspect, you identify the stress, and you reinforce. The structure doesn't need to be permanent. It needs to be adaptive. Adaptive. The word sat wrong in my vocabulary. I was a finished carpenter. I built things to last. I built joints that would hold for a century, surfaces that would age rather than decay. Adaptation was the opposite of permanence. It was the admission that what you'd built wasn't enough and might never be. "The goat needs more hay," Nora said. "The goat weighs 140 pounds on a platform rated for 12,000. The goat is the only creature in this village that isn't afraid of what's below us. That's worth more than load calculations." Margaret bleated from Platform 2, her voice carrying across the gantry with the indifferent authority of an animal that had decided the sky was simply where she lived now. Day 51, the night they solved the columns. I was asleep on Platform 6 when Marcus's voice came through the radio Felix had wired between platforms. A simple intercom system using repurposed CB units and hardwired cable. "Porter, column 7. They're on it." I was up and moving before the sentence ended, crossing the walkway in bare feet, feeling the familiar vibrations of the gantry through my soles. Vibrations I'd learned to read like a pulse. Normal vibration was the wind in the steel. The generator's hum transmitted through bolted connections, the settling of wood under temperature change. This vibration was different, rhythmic, ascending. Column 7 was a primary support at the gantry's midpoint, directly below the walkway between platforms 3 and 4. I reached the railing and looked down. Marcus was beside me, his headlamp aimed at the column's base. The sheet metal sleeve I'd installed was intact, unclimbed, ungripped. The surface was working as designed. Smooth, featureless, offering nothing. But 2 infected were not on the column. They were on each other. One stood at the column's base, pressing against it, motionless. The second had climbed onto the first's shoulders and was now standing upright, its hands reaching above the top edge of the sheet metal sleeve. The edge I'd set at 20 feet, and gripping the exposed steel of the original column above the sheathing. "Stacking," Marcus whispered. "They're not supposed to coordinate." "They're not coordinating. They're coinciding." One was against the column. The second was drawn to the same stimulus. It climbed the available surface, which happened to be a body. The second figure pulled itself above the sleeve's edge. Its arms wrapped around the bare column. Its legs found the first horizontal crossbrace at 22 feet. It stood on the brace, wobbling, its balance a negotiation between damaged vestibular function and brute mechanical persistence. 22 feet. The platform was at 30. 8 feet of open column remained between the crossbrace and the gantry's underside. "It can't reach the next brace," I said. The cross braces were spaced at 8-foot intervals. From the first brace at 22 feet, the next was at 30. The gantry floor itself. An 8-foot vertical climb on a smooth steel column with no intermediate footholds. The figure tried. It reached upward, hands on the column, feet on the brace, and attempted to shinny. Its coordination failed at the 2-foot mark. It slid back to the brace, tried again, slid back. "It's not going to make it," Marcus said. Then a third figure reached the base of the column. It climbed the first. The first didn't collapse. It braced, its legs rigid, its body a structural member. The third figure reached the second, which was standing on the cross brace. It climbed the second's body with the same brute, uncoordinated determination. The third figure now stood on the second figure's shoulders, and its hands were 6 feet below the gantry's underside. 3 bodies stacked, 28 feet of effective reach, 2 feet short. "We have margin," Marcus said. "We have 2 feet of margin. The margin was 22 feet 3 weeks ago." The column held the weight. It was rated for far more than 3 human bodies. The crossbrace held. My engineering held. Everything I'd built was performing exactly as designed, and it wasn't enough, because I hadn't designed for the variable that was now stacking itself below us with the implacable patience of a force that didn't need to sleep. By dawn, the stack had collapsed. The third figure fell, then the second. They dispersed into the log yard, returning to the ambient population that milled and waited and occasionally pressed against the columns as though testing a hypothesis they couldn't articulate. I called a meeting on platform 1. All 7 of us, plus Margaret, who attended every meeting whether invited or not, and whose presence I'd stopped denying, had a calming effect on discussions that would otherwise devolve into the particular panic of people who've just learned that their safety margin has decreased by 90% overnight. 2 feet, I said. That's what we have. If a fourth stacks on top of those 3, it reaches the underside of the gantry. From there, it can access the walkway. "Can we extend the sleeves?" Felix asked. "To what height? The column extends to the gantry floor. If I sleeve the entire column, I eliminate the cross bracing, which is what gives the structure its lateral stability. The braces aren't just footholds. They're structural members. Remove them, and the first strong wind collapses the gantry." "So the defense is the vulnerability," Nora said. "The defense has always been the vulnerability. Height works until they find a way to solve height. The question is whether they solve it faster than we can adapt." Ruth, who had been silent, spoke. "There's another option. We go higher." Ruth's proposal was to build a second tier. The mill's main building had a roof structure. Heavy timber trusses supporting a corrugated metal roof at 55 feet. The gantry system currently topped out at 40 feet, where it connected to the building's upper floor. Ruth proposed extending the village upward, using the roof trusses as the structural foundation for a new set of platforms at 50 to 55 feet. That's 75% higher than our current elevation, she said. Even if they learn to stack 4 high, 32 feet of reach, they'd need to stack 7 to reach the new platforms. 7 coordinated bodies in a vertical column. I don't believe the motor function can sustain that. You didn't believe they could stack 3, I said. I believe in engineering margins. You taught me that? Or I taught you that. Whichever direction the lesson traveled. The build would be the most complex structural project I'd undertaken since the village began. The roof trusses were original to the mill's 1960s construction. Old-growth Douglas fir, massive in dimension, but untouched by structural assessment in decades. Before I could build on them, I needed to inspect every member, every joint, every connection to the wall system that supported them. Deacon and I spent 2 days in the roof space. He knew every beam from below, from the sawyer's perspective, looking up while guiding logs through the breakdown saw. From above, the structure revealed itself differently. I found 3 fractured web members in the easternmost truss, a result of accumulated snow loads and the slow work of moisture through unsealed end grain. I found connection hardware, the bolts and plates that joined truss to wall. That had corroded in the humid air above the mill's steam kiln. I found a roof structure that was, like everything else in this valley, adequate until it wasn't. Can you fix it? Ruth asked. I can reinforce it. Sister new members alongside the damaged ones. Replace the corroded hardware. It's a week of work minimum, and I need lumber heavier than what's in the warehouse. The log yard, Deacon said. I'd been avoiding the log yard. It sat at ground level, open to the compound, populated by the infected that now numbered 63 by Marcus's latest count. But the yard still held raw logs. Unprocessed rounds of Douglas fir, some 20 inches in diameter, stacked in the rusting cradles where they'd been staged for the mill's saw that would never run again. I need those logs milled into beams, I said. Minimum 8 by 8 for the truss repairs, 12 by 12 for the new platform supports. The breakdown saw is on the main floor, Deacon said. Ground level. I'd need power to it, a clear run from the log yard into the building, and enough time to mill what you need without attracting every infected in the valley. How much time? To mill 8 beams? With the breakdown saw running? 6 hours of continuous operation. That saw produces 110 decibels. You could hear it in Ashland. 110 decibels in a valley with 63 infected who tracked sound was not a plan. It was an invitation, but the lumber we needed didn't exist in the warehouse's dimensional stock. The beams required for the roof truss repair and the upper-tier platforms had to be cut from raw logs, and the only saw capable of cutting them was on the ground floor in the territory we'd surrendered. Marcus proposed a solution that made my stomach drop and my engineering brain light up simultaneously. Run the saw at night. The infected's response to sound was consistent. They converged on the source. If we ran the saw, they would enter the building. All of them. Through the open bay doors that connected the log yard to the mill floor. Once inside, we'd close the doors from above using the overhead crane system Ruth had maintained, trapping the infected inside the building. While Deacon milled at a secondary saw position, we'd rig on the loading dock outside. You want to trap 63 infected inside the building we live on top of, I said. I want to clear the yard so Deacon can work, Marcus said. The building becomes the cage, the yard becomes the workspace. And if the building doesn't hold them? Ruth answered. The building held logs weighing 2,000 pounds apiece on a daily basis for 40 years. It will hold 63 bodies. Logs don't try the doors. The doors are steel-framed timber. I've inspected every one. They'll hold. The plan was reckless. The plan was necessary. The plan depended on every system Ruth had maintained, every structure I'd inspected, every observation Marcus had logged, and every cut Deacon had made in 19 years of operating the very saw we were about to wake from its 5-year silence. When? I said. Tomorrow night, Ruth said. Waning moon. Minimal visibility, maximum containment time before dawn. I looked at the group, 6 faces, each one a load I hadn't planned to bear and couldn't now set down. Then we prep today, I said, and nobody sleeps until the beams are cut. The sound of the breakdown saw at 11 p.m. on day 53 was the loudest thing the valley had heard since the last commercial flight over the Siskiyous. Ruth powered the saw from the generator through a cable run Felix had laid across the mill's main floor that afternoon, working at ground level for the first time since the platforms were built. He moved fast, silent, routing heavy-gauge wire from the maintenance shop's panel to the saw's motor housing while Marcus monitored the log yard's infected population from the gantry above. 67. 4 more since last count. At 10:50, everything was ready. The mill's bay doors, 3 of them, each 12 feet wide, steel-framed, mounted on overhead tracks, were open. The log yard lay beyond them, grey gravel under a thin moon, populated by dark figures standing in their customary stillness. The breakdown saw sat on the mill floor, its blade a 60-inch circular disc that Deacon had inspected and pronounced sharp. Beside it, a single log. An 18-inch Douglas fir round, 20 feet long, had been positioned that afternoon using the overhead crane Ruth operated from the gantry control station. "Ready?" Ruth said through the radio. "Ready," Deacon confirmed from the secondary position. The loading dock outside the building's east wall, where a portable bandsaw mill had been assembled from components Deacon had identified in the maintenance shop's deep storage. The breakdown saw inside was the bait. The bandsaw outside was the tool. I stood on the gantry above the mill floor, watching the ground through the steel grate walkway. The floor was empty. The bay doors were open. The night was still. Ruth threw the breaker. The breakdown saw screamed to life. The sound was physical. It entered the body through the sternum and the teeth simultaneously. 110 decibels of high-carbon steel, spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute, amplified by the mill's cavernous interior and projected through the open bay doors into the valley like a siren. The response was immediate. Every figure in the log yard oriented toward the sound. They didn't walk. They surged, a spasm of movement that was neither coordinated nor random, but something between, like iron filings aligning to a suddenly activated magnet. They entered through the bay doors in a wave, and not pushing, not fighting, just flowing toward the stimulus with the mindless urgency of water finding a drain. I counted from above. 60, 65, 70. More than Marcus's last tally. They'd been in the perimeter without us knowing, pressed against the building's walls in locations our observation hadn't covered. They filled the mill floor below me, congregating around the screaming saw, pressing toward it from all directions. The saw was enclosed in a safety cage. Original equipment, steel pipe and mesh. And the infected pushed against it like concertgoers against a barricade, their bodies absorbing the sound at point-blank range with an attentiveness that looked, in the dim gantry light, almost like worship. "Close the doors," I radioed. Ruth operated the overhead crane's auxiliary controls, the same system that had originally moved the bay doors for log delivery. The doors rolled on their tracks, heavy, grinding. The sound was lost beneath the saw's scream. The first door closed, the second, the third sealed with a steel-on-steel impact that I felt through the gantry floor. 70+ infected, trapped on the mill floor below us, absorbed in the sound of a saw that was cutting nothing. "Go," I radioed Deacon. Outside on the loading dock, Deacon started the bandsaw mill. Its sound was modest compared to the breakdown saw, a high whine rather than a scream. He began cutting the first log, which Marcus and Felix had positioned on the dock using a hand-operated chain hoist. The blade entered the wood, and the sound it produced. The specific singing resonance of steel through dense Douglas fir was one I knew Deacon hadn't heard in 5 years. He stood at the saw with the posture of a man who has returned to the one task his body was built to perform, and he cut. 8 beams, 6 hours. Deacon milled through the night while the breakdown saw ran inside the building, holding the infected in its acoustic grip. I monitored from the gantry, watching the bodies below through the steel grate, counting, recounting, checking the bay doors for any sign of structural distress. The doors held. Ruth's assessment was correct. They were designed for industrial loads, and 70 human bodies pressing without coordination did not exceed those loads. At 5 a.m., Deacon radioed from the dock. 8 beams, 4 8x8s, 4 12x12s, ready for crane lift. Ruth operated the crane. The beams rose from the dock to the gantry level, swinging in the pre-dawn air, fresh-cut Douglas fir releasing the scent of resin that mixed with the diesel exhaust and the metallic tang of the running saw, and the unnamed smell that rose from 70 bodies packed onto the mill floor below. At 5:30, we killed the breakdown saw. The silence that followed was the most disorienting sound I'd ever heard. The sudden absence of 110 decibels created a vacuum that seemed to pull the air out of the space. Below, the infected milled in confusion, their stimulus gone, their purpose evaporated. They began dispersing within the building, pressing against walls, against the bay doors, against the columns that supported the gantry above them. I watched a figure press its hands against column 7, the same column they'd stacked on days earlier, and push upward, not climbing, reaching. The gesture was directionless and futile, and in the grey light of dawn filtering through the mill's clerestory windows, possessed of a quality I refused to name because naming it would make it unbearable. Ruth opened the bay doors at 6 a.m. The infected drifted out over the next hour, returning to the log yard, to the perimeter, to the ambient patterns of movement that constituted their existence. The mill floor was empty by 7. The beams were on the gantry. The build could begin. The second tier went up in 9 days, and it changed the village from a settlement into something I didn't have a word for. I framed the upper platforms on the roof trusses, reinforced now with the 8x8 sisters Deacon had milled, each one bolted alongside its damaged counterpart with through bolts, torqued to specifications. I calculated myself, because no engineering table covers the loads of a sky village built on the bones of a dead lumber mill. The 12x12 beams became the primary supports for 3 new platforms at 52 feet. 22 feet above the original gantry, 47 feet above the ground. Marcus rigged new vertical access between the tiers. The elevator winch system extended, with a second platform that traveled from the gantry level to the roof level. Felix wired the upper platforms into the electrical system, running conduit along the truss members with the confidence of an electrician who had accepted that building codes no longer existed, but that the principles underlying them still mattered. Nora established the medical station on the upper tier. "If we're retreating upward," she said, "the medical supplies go to the highest point. Triage descends, treatment ascends." Ruth relocated the generator controls to the upper platform, giving herself operational command of the mill's power systems from the highest accessible point. Deacon built a pen for Margaret. Yes, the goat ascended to the second tier via the elevator, which she tolerated with the same impassive dignity she'd shown during her original ascent to the first gantry, and installed it beside the rainwater collection system he'd rigged using the roof's drainage channels. By day 62, the village had 2 tiers, 9 platforms, shelters for 7 people, and a goat, storage, medical, communications, and power systems distributed across a vertical span of 52 feet. From the upper tier, the view extended beyond the valley. I could see the Siskiyou Ridge to the south, the Table Rocks to the northwest, the distant haze of the Cascades to the east. The world from 52 feet looked both larger and more empty than it did from 30. The trade with Harlan's group continued. On day 58, Kenji had arrived with diesel and a request. Could I design a raised platform system for the ranch? The infected had reached Bear Creek. Harlan's ground-level fortifications were holding, but she'd seen what we'd built at the mill and recognized the advantage that elevation provided. I drew the plans that evening on Platform 6. A modular platform system, using the dimensional lumber we'd trade them, designed for rapid assembly on existing structures. The plans were simple, replicable, engineered for people who didn't have a finished carpenter's joints, but could drive nails straight and follow a diagram. I handed them to Kenji with a material list and a set of connection details that would ensure the platforms held through winter. "This is more than a trade," Kenji said. "This is a gift. It's engineering. Engineering doesn't work if it stays in one place." He took the plans. He looked at me. "My mother says you think too much and build too well. She means it as a compliment." "I know how she means it." He left with the plans and the lumber. 3 weeks later, Marcus reported seeing elevated platforms on Harlan's ranch through his long-range binoculars. Rough-framed, functional, inhabited. Our design, adapted. Our village, propagated. The mill was no longer the only structure in the valley that reached for the sky. On the evening of day 62, I sat on the upper tiers railing. Mortis and tenon, 200-pound test, because I still couldn't help it. And listened to the village settle into its nighttime rhythms. Felix's lights on the lower gantry, Ruth's generator humming, Margaret's occasional bleat, Deacon singing an old mill song to no one in particular, Nora and Marcus arguing about whether the behavioral data supported a plateau in infected climbing ability or merely a pause. Below all of it, on the ground in the dark, 70-odd figures stood in the log yard and did not look up. The distance between us, 52 feet now, measured in lumber and steel, and the labor of 7 people who had built their way above the reach of something that never stopped trying to reach them, felt, for the first time, like enough. But enough is a carpenter's word, not a guarantee, and the wood remembers every stress it has ever absorbed. Day 70. The night something new climbed column 7. I was on the upper tier when the vibration came, not through the radio, not through a voice, but through the structure itself. A rhythmic pulse transmitted through steel and wood, felt through my feet as I stood on a platform I'd built with joints tight enough to transfer sensation, a pulse that meant something was applying repetitive force to the framework below. I descended to the gantry level. Marcus was already at the railing above column 7, his headlamp trained downward. I joined him and looked. 3 infected, stacked as before. The sheet metal sleeve defeated the lower climb, but the stacking had become more efficient. The base figure braced with wider footing, the second mounted faster, the third ascended the combined height with a fluency that hadn't existed 6 weeks prior. 3 bodies reached 28 feet. The cross brace at 22 feet provided a standing platform for the uppermost figure, which now reached to within 2 feet of the original gantry floor. This was the old problem. We'd solved it by going higher. The upper tier at 52 feet was still 24 feet above the 3 stacks reach, margin restored. But a 4th figure was approaching column 7, and a 5th. They've never stacked more than 3, Marcus said. They've never had a reason to stack more than 3. The rope gave them a reason to climb. The column gave them a reason to stack. The gantry gives them a target. Remove the target, which we did by going higher, and the behavior should extinguish. Should. The 4th figure climbed the stack. It was slow, graceless, a body solving a problem through repetition rather than comprehension. It achieved the shoulders of the 3rd. 4 figures stacked. The uppermost reached 32 feet. Its hands touched the underside of the original gantry walkway. The steel grate I'd walked every morning for 43 days. It gripped the grate, it pulled, its feet left the body below and it hung suspended, arms through the grate's openings and body swinging. It pulled again, an elbow hooked over the grate's edge. It's on the gantry, Marcus said. The figure hauled itself onto the walkway. It stood on the lower tier. Our original village, the platforms I'd built in the first weeks, the commons where we'd eaten and argued and decided to trade and decided to grow. It stood on platform 1 and turned its head in that slow, scanning oscillation, and then it moved along the walkway toward the next platform. Toward platform 3, toward Nora and Felix's quarters, where the lights were on. "Nora!" I shouted into the radio. "Felix, get up! Get to the elevator, now!" The next 4 minutes were the longest structural test of my life. Nora and Felix emerged from their shelter as the figure reached platform 3. They saw it 10 feet away on the same walkway, moving toward the light with the same stimulus-driven persistence that had drawn 70 bodies into the mill on Saw Night. Felix grabbed Nora's arm, and they ran. Not toward the elevator, which was at the far end of the gantry, but toward the vertical access between tiers, a fixed ladder I'd installed as a secondary route during the upper tier construction. The ladder. A fixed steel ladder, bolted to the truss framework, ascending 22 feet from the gantry level to the upper tier. I'd installed it because the elevator was slow and a single access point was a bottleneck. I'd installed a ladder. Nora climbed it in seconds. Felix followed. The figure on platform 3 oriented toward the sound of their ascent and moved to the ladder's base. It gripped the rungs. It climbed. The fixed rungs provided exactly the feedback Marcus had warned about on day 43. A uniform diameter, regular spacing, a problem simple enough for degraded motor function to solve. The figure climbed 3 rungs. 4. 5. It was ascending the ladder with a competence that made my stomach fold in on itself because the ladder was something I had built, and it was teaching my enemy how to reach me. Marcus moved before I could speak. He was at the ladder's upper mounting point with a wrench, removing the bolts that secured it to the truss. The ladder was designed to be permanent. I'd engineered it as fixed infrastructure. Marcus was converting it to temporary in real time, backing out bolts while a climbing figure ascended from below. The last bolt came free. The ladder swung outward, away from the truss, carrying the figure with it. It fell, a 35-foot arc ending in a sound I didn't watch produce itself. Marcus caught the ladder before it followed and hauled it onto the upper platform. We stood on the upper tier, 7 people and a goat, holding a ladder that an hour ago had been part of the village and was now the evidence that no part of the village was permanent. "No more fixed access," I said. "Nothing stays attached below. Nothing." Marcus nodded. Nora was breathing hard against Felix's shoulder. Ruth was already at the winch controls, raising the elevator platform to the upper tier and locking it in position. Deacon held Margaret's collar, steadying the goat, who was bleating at a pitch that suggested even she had recognized a threshold had been crossed. Below us, on the gantry we'd built first and trusted most, 2 more figures pulled themselves through the steel grate. The lower tier was breached. Our original village platform 1 through 6. 43 days of construction. Every joint I'd cut and every railing I'd carved was no longer ours. We didn't abandon the lower tier. We adapted it. This is the part of the story where a different person, a person who built things to last and expected them to remain, would have collapsed under the weight of watching his work fail. I didn't collapse. A finished carpenter doesn't collapse when a joint opens. He investigates the failure, identifies the cause, and redesigns. The lower tier became a buffer zone. Marcus rigged a system of noise-making devices. Cans on strings, wind-activated clappers made from scrap metal, Felix's radio units tuned to static. That created a persistent low-level sound environment on the gantry level. The infected that had reached the lower tier were drawn to these sounds and remained, milling on the platforms and walkways that had been our commons, our storage, our home. They were below us. We were above them. The separation was now the 22 feet between tiers, plus the absence of any fixed connection. The elevator was the only route, and the elevator was controlled from above. The village's functional area contracted to the upper tier. 3 platforms at 52 feet, connected by walkways I'd reinforced with every remaining fastener in our inventory. The space was tighter. 7 people in a footprint designed to supplement, not replace, the lower tier. Food storage was halved because half the stores were now on platforms occupied by infected, who stood among our canned goods and our water containers with no interest in consuming them and no capacity to leave on their own. "We need to retrieve the stores," Nora said on the second morning. "The lower tier has at least 7 infected on it at any given time," Marcus said. "Retrieving supplies means descending into an occupied area." "Nora's right," I said. "The stores are survival. Without them, we're measuring days, not months." We designed a retrieval system. The elevator descended with a crew of 2, Marcus and me, while the rest operated the noise devices from above, drawing the lower tiers infected toward the eastern end of the gantry, while we worked the western end, loading supplies onto the elevator platform for Ruth to winch up. The operation took 3 runs over 2 days and recovered approximately 70% of our stored food, water, and medical supplies. The remaining 30% was in areas too densely occupied to access. 70% of a supply calculated for 7 people at 3 months. That left us with approximately 2 months. 2 months, Ruth said. "That's what we have unless we expand the trade or start producing food." "Producing food at 52 feet, I said. "Nora has been talking about rooftop growing containers, soil from the creek bank, hauled up on the elevator, shallow root crops, radishes, lettuce, herbs. Not caloric sufficiency, but supplemental nutrition. The roof's load capacity is something you'll calculate, and it will work, because you'll make it work." Ruth was not asking me. She was telling me what I would do, and the telling was not authority, but trust. The trust of a woman who had watched me build a village in the air and knew that the builder's response to a collapsing floor is not to grieve, but to build the next floor. On day 75, Harlan's group made contact by radio. Their elevated platforms were holding. The infected had not breached. Kenji had modified my original design with a retractable access system he'd developed independently. A drawbridge mechanism using counterweights and rope. The design was clever, efficient, and better than mine. He improved it, Harlan said over the radio. Good, I said. He wants to bring the design to you, a trade, his access system for your growing platform plans. He doesn't need to trade for plans. I'll give him the plans. He wants to trade. He wants to stand on your platforms and show you what he built. He says it's the only way you'll trust that it works. I looked at Cora. At Ruth. The name confusion lived only in my head, a ghost from a different story. Ruth was watching me from the winch station, her hands resting on the controls she'd maintained since day one, the controls that raised and lowered the only connection between our world and the one below it. Tell him to come, I said. We'll lower the platform. The elevator descended, 22 feet of cable unspooling, the platform dropping toward a lower tier that was no longer ours but was still structurally something I'd built. Something that held. Something that carried weight it was never designed for, and continued carrying it because the joints were tight and the beams were sound, and the carpenter who'd framed it had believed, despite everything, that the wood would hold. The wood held. It held the infected who stood on it without purpose. It held the supplies we'd retrieve in careful raids. It held the memory of 43 days of habitation and the evidence that even a carpenter's best work is temporary in a world that keeps changing the loads. Kenji arrived at the fence line at noon. Marcus lowered the elevator. A young man with a set of plans and a handshake and an improvement I hadn't designed ascended into a village that was smaller than it had been a week ago and larger than it had ever been. He stepped onto the upper tier and looked at the joints. He ran his hand along a railing I'd built with mortise and tenon connections at 52 feet because I still couldn't help it. You build like it matters, he said. It does matter. I know. That's why I came up. I still do the morning walk. The route is shorter now. 3 platforms instead of 9. The circuit measured in minutes rather than the half hour it once required. I check every joint, every bolt, every connection where wood meets steel and load meets structure. I press my hand against the surfaces and listen for the sounds that wood makes when it's bearing more than it should. The whisper before the crack, the deflection before the failure. Below us, on the lower tier, they stand among the platforms I built in the first weeks. They don't damage them. They don't use them. They inhabit them the way weather inhabits a building. Gradually, indifferently, with a patience that has no end because it has no intent. We are 9 now. Kenji stayed. Harlan sends lumber and fuel and questions about structural design that I answer in drawings I lower on the elevator. Marcus logs the climbing data. Ruth maintains the machines. Deacon sings to the goat. Nora grows radishes in rooftop containers that I calculated to the ounce. The wood holds. It holds because I built it well, and I built it well because my hands know no other way, and the hands are enough. Not forever, not against everything, but today, at 52 feet, in a village made of lumber above a mill that made the lumber, the wood holds. I carved tomorrow's mark into the railing, 91. The wood holds.